Well, brothers and sisters, welcome again in the name of Christ. We are here this afternoon to continue on in our series in the Encountering Jesus series, and today we're looking at Mark chapter 3, verse 1 through 6, and our sermon title today is called Jesus and the Cancel Culture. And as we're looking through the Encountering Jesus series, today we're encountering a people group, a political party of sorts, called the Pharisees. And before we get to the Pharisees, I thought we will speak about cancel culture. Cancel culture. I'm pretty sure we've all seen it. We're witnessing it. We're seeing this phenomenon that's happening whereby the majority unanimously hold people of power, people of influence, accountable for their actions. And sometimes it means bringing up issues of sexual harassment from the past, or maybe abuse of power in the past. Sometimes it means scouring through the old tweets and looking through old emails and looking through the old Instagram posts. Sometimes it means to go back and judge past people for their inappropriate behaviors in our standards today. Many celebrities and powerful people have been canceled over the past couple of years, ranging from very horrible crimes that were done in the past but are now brought up into the surface, but also maybe a joke that went a little bit too far, but it was done by a person of power or a political person, so they're canceled. Sometimes the canceled person is canceled for such a minute issue, but because they're rich, because they're of people of influence, they get canceled. But most of these people that are getting canceled are rich and famous, right? I mean, if you're not that rich or famous, you're probably not going to get canceled. I mean, why cancel you? You're not famous to begin with. But sometimes I'm thinking, people that are getting canceled, they're people of power, the people that are rich anyways, they're going to be okay, right? But it still sucks sometimes when they're being canceled for maybe something very minute, right? But it still is, it's still an issue. And some people I know are saying we need to cancel culture, right? So there's now a new movement where we're trying to cancel culture. And sometimes someone you think should be canceled, you think, man, that person should be canceled. They're not canceled, right? And so you're just like, man, the inconsistency, what's going on here. Some people that are being canceled, you're like, what? They're being canceled for that? But then this person here, they're the ones telling this person to be canceled, but they did the same thing, but they're not being canceled for it. And so there seems to be inconsistencies and contradictions here. We're seeing people left and right being canceled. People from history, like our American forefathers, are being canceled for had their belief in slavery and so forth. And then even recently, Dr. Seuss was canceled, right, by his own company, right? It was canceled for insensitive drawings of Asian and African Americans. And so what do we see here from this? We have this phenomenon that's happening of cancel culture, and then we have, really seems like there's two sides to this whole thing, right? You have on one side those who are part of the cancel culture movement, and on one side they seem to be speaking a language of justice, and we need to hold people of power accountable, and I think there's something good about that. But the thing we're seeing from a lot of people that are about the cancel culture is that there's a lack of grace. Right? There's a lack of mercy. The spirit of cancel culture, I think is good, right? We need to talk about hidden sins and their actions, and they need to be held accountable. But on the other side, you have the other side that are opponents of the cancel culture, and they're not getting the sentiment behind the cancel culture. And their response is more like this: big deal. It was in the past. Why are we bringing up past history? Right? And on the other side, the opponents of cancel culture, they seem to be more belittling justice and ignorance and the likes. So you sort of have these two opposite sides, like those that are for cancel culture and those that are against. But what we're going to see in this passage and what we see throughout the gospel is that Christ doesn't fit in either one of these groups. Right? Because actually he's the one that got canceled himself, but for the wrong reasons. And actually, if anyone should be canceled, it should be every single one of us here. Right? We should be canceled from God's community. We should be canceled because of our hidden sins. But God can bring that up to the surface because he knows what's in our heart. But instead of us being canceled, in some ways I can say it this way, Jesus was canceled on our behalf. Does that make sense? You understanding this? Are you jiving with me here? Like, he was canceled on our behalf. He took on our punishment so that you and I would not be canceled. Instead, what we see is that he shows us grace. And so what we need in the gospel, what we see in the gospel is this. I use this phrase, if you guys read my blog this past weekend, I use this phrase in that blog, but we need to have this sort of liminal state of mind. Does that make sense? We need to have this liminal state of mind. People that are immigrants and minorities, we know of this liminal state of mind quite well. Right? The liminal state of mind, it means the in-betweenness. Like, I am Korean, but I'm also American, but I'm not necessarily only Korean, I'm also American, so I'm in this middle ground. A lot of immigrants, a lot of people of color, a lot of minorities, we know of this liminalness that we're in. And I think that's the kind of mindset we need to have as Christians. As, even that play on word is saying that we're not even really natives to this country or to this world. We're actually immigrants because our home is in another world altogether. We need to have this kind of liminal mind where we are not for cancel culture per se, though we can sympathize with it, but nonetheless, we're also against injustice, and we want it to be brought out to light, while still holding mercy and grace towards sinners. Does that make sense? That's the kind of attitude that we see we need to have as followers of Christ, that we can be angry towards sin, yet still show mercy to the sinner. Why? Because of Jesus Christ. We need that fine balance of not playing by either of these two camps and their rules. With that being stated, then let's look at our next passage. We're looking at Mark chapter 3, verse 1 through 6. And if you're able to stand, please rise and stand at this time as we read God's holy and inerrant word. As we read Mark chapter 3, verse 1 through 6, I just want us to take into consideration this fact that this is the same passage that would be referenced in Matthew chapter 12 and Luke chapter 6 respectively. And in my sermon, I'll be talking about all three of them together to make one whole picture. But this is Mark's account of this incident that happened. Mark chapter 3, verse 1 through 6. I'll be reading from the ESV. Again, he entered the synagogue, and a man was there with a withered hand. And he said to the man with the withered hand, "Come here." And they watched Jesus to see whether he would heal him on the Sabbath, so that they might accuse him. And he said to them, "Is it lawful on the Sabbath to do good or to do harm, to save life or to kill?" But they were silent. And he looked around at them with anger, grieved at their hardness of heart, and said to the man, "Stretch out your hand." He stretched it out, and his hand was restored. The Pharisees went out and immediately held counsel with the Herodians against him, how to destroy him. The word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. You may be seated at this time. So our sermon title today is called Jesus and the Cancel Culture. I'm trying to take into consideration Mark's account, but also see Matthew's account and Luke's accounts and bring them all together to combine this story. And we start off with this. One day, on the Sabbath day, which is the Saturday, right? On the Sabbath day, Jesus went out to teach at the synagogue, very similar to what we're doing right now here today. And it's as if some of the Pharisees came to trap Jesus. They wanted to cancel Jesus, right? That was what they were trying to do. And you see, for the Jews, Sabbath was a very important thing. It was an important day, and rightly so, because God commanded his people to obey the Sabbath. Sabbath was the day God rested. That was a Saturday. But for us as Christians now, in light of Christ, our Sabbath day is now Sunday, because Sunday is the day Christ rose from the dead, and we're centering around Christ. And so the Sabbath now is Sunday, but back then the Sabbath was a Saturday. And the people were worshiping on the Sabbath. And on the Sabbath, God said to rest and do not work. The whole idea was to stay one day to where you go, you know what, this is the day where it launches for the rest of the day, or the rest of the week, where I worship God. And so I'm not to focus on my work, I'm to focus on God and worshiping Him. That was the idea behind the Sabbath, right? But the Jews, what they did was they added laws, extra laws, so that you wouldn't break the fourth commandment. So they brought in, like, if we was to say like this way, they brought a fence around the tree so you wouldn't pick the fruit. Right? That's what they were trying to do. They were trying to put laws to separate themselves from breaking the first law, the fourth commandment. And so they were making big deals about the secondary laws. And if you broke the secondary laws, it was as if you broke the primary law, and so you should be punished. And they had all these kinds of things of what, is considered breaking the law. So even today, I think if you go to Israel today on a Sabbath, you will see a lot of the Jews will not press the elevator button, right? Because that's kindling of fire, and that's considered working. Because if you press the button, you're sparking a electricity, and it's kindling of fire, and so that's considered working. So a lot of Jews on the Sabbath, if you on the elevator with them, they won't press the button. You have to press the button. They'll just be like looking around to see. And that's sort of the rules that they kind of implemented with themselves. And so they put all these secondary laws for the primary law. And one of the famous groups of people that were doing this were the Pharisees. I love the way the New Testament scholar N.T. Wright puts it, that the Pharisees are like, in many ways, if we can associate them, they are the cultural influencers of our days. And so they are, N.T. Wright would say, they are the reporters of the world. They are the tabloids and the TMZs of the world, right? This is who they are. They would often pinpoint people and shame them, right? That's what TMZ, that's what tabloids do, right? They go around and spill other people's beans because they were trying to bring shame upon what they're doing. They're putting their actions, these celebrities, these people, they're putting their actions on full display for the rest of the world to see, not thinking that, man, I'm about to ruin this person's life. And not thinking upon their own sins, but they're quick. They're quick to reveal people's controversies. They're quick to bring out their trash for the public to see. And we as people, what do? We just gobble that up, right? And they're quick to judge, quick to bring shame upon others. And notice a lot of these writers, they're erudite people. They're people that are intelligent. They can. They went to these big name schools, and they're going out there and they're trying to bring out shame. And that's what the Pharisees are: intelligent, scholarly people, but really out there as influencers to shame others if they break the secondary laws. And Jesus often fought with these kinds of people, the self-righteous ones, right? The legalistics, the ones who were too quick to judge, but didn't take into consideration their own sins. Sounds similar to cancel culture, doesn't it? And so these people wanted to trap Jesus. They wanted to cancel Jesus. And so they were waiting for Jesus to mess up. Why? If I can go off a little bit off tangent here, they wanted Jesus to mess up because if you really think about it, if anyone that Jesus could sort of like associate as part of his political party, it would have been the Pharisees. Right? Because why? Jesus is all about righteousness. He's all about holiness. That's what the Pharisees were all about too. They were all about righteousness, being pure and being holy. But here's the problem. Jesus didn't play by their rules. That's the problem. He sounds like a Pharisee, but he doesn't jive. He doesn't play by their rules. Pharisees especially didn't associate with sinners. They shouldn't associate with themselves. But nonetheless, they thought they weren't sinners. They thought everyone else was sinners. But they wanted to be as clean and holy as possible, so they didn't hang out with dirty people, right? They didn't hang out with lepers. They didn't hang out with prostitutes. They didn't hang out with people that are poor. And they saw many people as sinners. And if you hung out with a sinner, namely, let's say even Gentiles, non-Jews, then you were considered unclean and they wouldn't hang out with you. But Jesus, if he had to align himself with any political group at that period of time, he would have been closely associated with the Pharisees. But the problem was, he didn't act like a Pharisee. And that's what got the Pharisees so annoyed. And I look at that, and I kind of see that in our world today, right? When we look at our political system, right? There is a Republican Party, and there's the Democrat Party. There's the conservatives, and then there are the progressives, or the liberals. Well, the Republican Party, what do they do? They act as if Jesus is on their side, right? Some people just think, oh, you're Christian, you must be a Republican. Like there's like that association, right? That if you're a Republican, it means you're a Christian. Well, when you look at the Republicans biblically, you can't say that Jesus is on their side. You just can't. You know, some of the values that Republicans have might be values that Jesus would have, but yet Jesus doesn't play by the Republican rules. Their foundations are different. But the Democrats, they do the same, right? The Democrats think that Jesus is on their side. And when you look at a Democrat, when you see it biblically, you got to say, man, I don't think Jesus jives with the Democrats as well. He doesn't associate with their beliefs either. He might have some of their values. He might align his values with theirs, but Jesus doesn't play by their rules. You see that? Jesus doesn't fit in either one of these circles. And I love the way Pastor Jim Wallace, who's also an author of that famous book, God's Politics, he says it this way: the right get it wrong, and the left don't get it. Right? And I think that's a great way to put the Republican-Democrat Party. The right get it wrong, and the left just don't get it. If Jesus was living in our day and age, man, he would have been canceled by now. He was so famous, he was so popular, and people were waiting. They would be waiting to cancel him at any moment because he just seemed so crazy. You know, and so here we see Jesus. The Pharisees want to cancel him because Jesus is acting like a Pharisee, but doesn't really have the foundation of the Pharisees. He's wholly other. He's different. So they want to cancel Jesus. So they bring about a man with a shriveled hand, which means that this guy is vulnerable. He's a vulnerable person. And these religious folks, they don't care about this man's well-being. They're just using him as a pawn, right? They're using him as a pawn. Sounds familiar? It sounds like people with power, right? That just love to use people for their political gain. And they were looking for a reason to accuse Jesus, to cancel him. And so they brought him. Can you just imagine this? It's like Jesus is preaching, like, and some Pharisees come over and they bring a man to sit here, and they're just waiting for Jesus to fall into this trap. Like, how is this in any ways worshiping God? But here they are bringing this man so that they can fault Jesus. And so they want to see if Jesus would heal this man on the Sabbath, because to them, their logic is thinking like this: if Jesus heals this man on a Sabbath, that is considered working. And that if that's considered working, then what is Jesus doing? Jesus is breaking God's law, and he's sinning. And so that's the trap they're trying to bring Jesus in. They know Jesus loves people. They know Jesus can heal people. So let's bring a man on the Sabbath and see if Jesus will heal this man. And if he heals this man, he's breaking the Sabbath, and we're going to cancel him. Right? They've thought this through. And notice what happens. Jesus, being God, knows what they're thinking, but he still goes along with it. And they ask Jesus, Jesus, what is lawful? With a withered hand, shouldn't you help him? Isn't that the good thing to do? But if you heal him, it's the Sabbath. Remember that. If you heal him on the Sabbath, you're breaking God's law, and you're sinning. All right? And so Jesus looks at the crowd. If I was Jesus, and thank God I'm not Jesus, but if I had Jesus' like power to read minds, I'd be like, I'm done with you. I don't want to talk to you. You're not even worth my time. But Jesus sort of says to the man with a withered hand, stand up, rise up. See, Jesus has compassion for this man with a withered hand. And he wants everyone to see, not just the Pharisees, but the way the book of Luke expresses it is that it's as if Jesus even wants this man to stand for the public, everyone else in the congregation to see this man. And Jesus brings up a very interesting question in the book of the book of Matthew, chapter 12. Jesus says, listen, if anyone, this is what Matthew chapter 12 says, if any of you had a sheep and it fell into the pit on the Sabbath, wouldn't you take hold of it and lift it out of the pit? Right? Are you tracking with what Jesus is saying here? Basically, he's saying is, if you pick up that animal from the pit, if you lift him out of the pit, what are you doing? You are working. Right? You see what Jesus is doing here? Jesus is exposing their hypocrisy, their double standard. Oh, if you heal this man's hand, that's considered working. But Jesus is saying, but don't you work? Because when an animal falls into a pit, and Jesus knows the Pharisees and their bylaws, you put that exception that if an animal falls into a pit, you can actually pick it up and it wouldn't be considered work. And what Jesus is doing is partly he's exposing their heart. Because an animal is like finance for them, right? Oh, I mean, if it deals with finance, of course you can kind of break the law of God because it's your finances. So that's perfectly okay, is what seems to be implied. And Jesus is calling them out on their own hypocrisy. That question he's asking is implying that they, the Pharisees, the righteous ones, are contradicting their own invented laws. And it's interesting because the Pharisees are the austere ones. They're the strict rabbis. They're the ones that really hold to the law, so they think. But a lot of times they have all these leniencies. They have all these bylaws that they can sort of have loopholes to. And one of them will be that example, that you can't work on the Sabbath, except if your animal falls into a pit, then maybe you can pick it up and it wouldn't be considered work. And there were all these different kinds of groups of people during Jesus' days. There were the Sadducees. They were the ones who had all the power. They had the authority. Okay, and they had all the authority in the nation. And then you had the Zealots, who were like the political activists who were against the Roman government trying to overthrow the Roman government that was overseeing them. And then you had the Pharisees, who were the influencers of the days, right? And they were always speaking about how we need to obey the law and we need to observe it and stuff like that. But there was another group of people that aren't really mentioned in the Bible, but they're called the Essenes. The Essenes are not mentioned in the Bible because not many people knew about who the Essenes were, but during Jesus' day, there were these group of people called the Essenes. And we didn't really know about them till around the 1940s and 1950s because there was something called the Dead Sea Scrolls. I don't know how many of you guys have heard of that. Maybe you've heard of it in a Dan Brown novel. That's because it was mentioned there. But the Dead Sea Scrolls were these scrolls that were found in a cave outside of outside of Jerusalem. All right, it was this amazing archaeological finding where we found that there was this group of people called the Essenes, and they were these people group that lived during the time of Jesus. And so they were another political party. But the thing about the Essenes was this. They thought that everyone else was too liberal. Like, the thing about the Pharisees, they were so strict, but they thought that the Pharisees were so liberal. So what they ended up doing was they said, no, we cannot stay here in Roman territory, right? This is not our holy land. We're going to leave to the caves, right? And so they left to the caves because they thought Jerusalem was unholy. And they said, we're going to wait when the Messiah comes. And when the Messiah overthrows the Roman government, then we're going to come back to society. But till then, we're going to live in our own community, right? Away from the rest of you guys because you guys are unholy. We want to be our own holy community. So there were these scrolls that were found called the Dead Sea Scrolls. And in the scrolls, there were all these different things. One of the most important things, which is so awesome for Christians, was that they found the oldest text of the Bible, right? We didn't have that old of a text of a Bible. Our text was from the medieval period, right? That's past AD. But we found these texts from 1st century BC. These are older than what we had previously. And we went and we looked at those scrolls. You realize those scrolls were just as accurate as what we had in the medieval period, right? So it was a really awesome win for Christians, right? Showing how legitimate our Bible is. But there were all these other scrolls that were there. One of the scrolls was telling how the Essenes lived their life, their rituals and things like that. And in the rituals, one of the things they talked about was this thing called the Damascus document. And in the document, there was a section where they were talking about what they do on the Sabbath. And so I wanted to read this portion for you. It says this. In the Dead Sea Scrolls, the Essenes community, this is how they believed they should be on the Sabbath. One of the things they said was this: on the Sabbath, no man, you were listening, no man shall assist a beast to give birth on the Sabbath, and if that beast falls into a cistern or pit, he shall not lift it out on the Sabbath. You see what's going on here? Is they're saying it's like, we have no exceptions to the Sabbath. You cannot work at all. And so if your money, your animal, falls into a pit, you can't pick it up, not on the Sabbath. It's breaking God's fourth commandment, right? And it's interesting. I remember reading that when I was in college, when I was taking a class on Dead Sea Scrolls, and I was reading that passage, and I was like, fascinating. It's like as if Jesus knew the Essenes were there, right? And it's as if Jesus is making fun of the Pharisees and saying, not only are you contradicting your own laws, because you're working on the Sabbath, technically, when you pick up an animal off the pit, but you're not even that holy. Because you pick up animals from the pit, that's part of your bylaws, but the more stricter people, the Essenes, don't do what you're doing. They're at least consistent with their bylaws. You're not even consistent. And it's sort of insulting them. You're not as righteous as you think you are, he says to the Pharisees. So Jesus says, isn't a human life worth more than an animal's life? If you Pharisees are willing to pick up an animal out of the pit on the Sabbath, shouldn't I be able to help this man with his withered hand? And Jesus becomes so disappointed with them. Because you see, what's so interesting is, I didn't think about this, but Paul Miller says it this way. He says, when Jesus was speaking to them, shouldn't I be able to help this man? What he was doing was he was pleading with them. Think of it this way. I would be like, if I knew what was going through their minds, I'd be like, I don't want to deal with you. I don't have the bandwidth to deal with you right now. I don't have time to debate with you. I'm just going to heal this man's hand. But Jesus was wanting them to convince and trying to convince them to see that this was a good thing to do. Do you understand what's going on here? Jesus actually loved the Pharisees. That he wanted them to see, can you pleading with them, have mercy on this man. Can you not see that this is not a sin? It's actually a good thing for me to heal his hand. He's being patient with the self-righteous Pharisees. He's pleading for them to be merciful. But their silence implies that they think that an animal's life is far more important than this man's life, a man with a withered hand. They thought more about caring for obeying the law of a law, right? You see what's going on? For a law of the law. Not even the law, not even the fourth commandment, but this was a bylaw. They were more passionate about protecting that than a human being. And it says in the book of Mark, in Mark chapter 3, it says that Jesus was angry. Yeah. Jesus got angry. And just before you think that being angry is a sin, angry is not a sin. We'll soon talk about that. Jesus got angry quite a bit. And Jesus here gets angry because of why? He gets angry for the right reason. He gets angry for the Pharisees' lack of compassion. He gets angry at them, like, man, how do you not care? You guys are boasting about loving God's law. How can you not care for this human being? And Jesus scans the audience, the rest of the room. Anyone? Anyone going to say something that this is okay with this man's hand? He's looking for anyone to approve of this healing, but no one budges. No one moves. Everyone is silent. And so his anger wells up into sadness, into disgust, into their callousness. And he grieves at their heartlessness. But notice, Jesus' anger is quite different than our anger. Notice what Paul Miller says, that his anger leads, I love this, he says, Jesus' anger leads to an act of love. He doesn't get all passive-aggressive, nor does he vent, oh my gosh, are you serious right now? He doesn't do that. He's angry. And that anger leads him to heal this man. His anger leads him to love. That's so fascinating, right? Our anger doesn't lead to love. Our anger leads to hatred. Our anger leads to like, oh, or hurt you. We have all kinds of foul words we say in our minds to people when they hurt us. But here, Jesus, his love controls his anger. It's actually quite different from the Pharisees, who in the book of Luke and Matthew say that the Pharisees were really angry at Jesus, that Jesus broke their rules again, calling them out and embarrassing them with their own hypocrisy. So they want to cancel Jesus even more, right? And now they want to really kill Jesus. And so Jesus' anger leads to love, but their anger leads to self-centeredness. Their anger leads to self-righteousness and leads to retaliation and revenge rather than to love. Man, that's the story we have for us today. And I wanted to give 2 application points here for us as we come to the conclusion, or to our application points. Number 1 is this: to see that in many ways we are like the Pharisees, and therefore we need to live a life of mercy. We are very similar to the Pharisees, and so we need to live a life of mercy. And the second point is this, brothers and sisters: be careful in your anger. Be careful in your anger. Let me get to the first point here. We are like the Pharisees, and so we need to have a bit more mercy. What we see here is this picture is really a picture of the gospel. You know, I hope by now, being at C4 for some time for a lot of you guys, been members of C4, you can it makes sense that I'm saying this, right? That we are very similar to the Pharisees. That we are so similar to them. Too often we are so hypocritical, so legalistic, that sometimes we're so emphasizing on the law that we don't have mercy on others. And we're so contradictory in the way of our lives. We use others to gain an experience. We use others to gain something from them. And we're so similar like the Pharisees. And you know who the Pharisees were? Oftentimes they were the enemies of Jesus in the stories. And sometimes we think Pharisees are others, but never me. Well, I know who a Pharisee is. Even if I said we are Pharisees, this, we're probably thinking about, oh yeah, it's that person over there. Like, I hope this person's listened to the sermon, because this is so them. But oftentimes we all are Pharisees. If we take a good look at ourselves, if we're really honest to ourselves, we would see that we are Pharisees. But what is so profound is, even in the story we see, Jesus' care and Jesus' patience, even with the Pharisees. Man, that's painful for me to hear. That Jesus was even patient with the Pharisees. You can't put Jesus in a... It's like, oh, obviously Jesus and the Pharisees are the enemies. Jesus loved the poor, Pharisees hated the poor. Jesus loved the Gentiles, Pharisees hated the Gentiles. Jesus loved the sinners, Pharisees hated the sinners. So logically concludes that Jesus must have hated the Pharisees. But actually we see time and time again, he actually even loved the Pharisees. A couple of times in the book of Luke, he dines with the Pharisees. It's like as if Jesus loves even those who cancel others. Right? And he loves and he loves those who cancel others. And this hits me hard, because I'm going to be honest with you guys. I think this may be maybe not just me, but I think we can all kind of say this, but I really do not like self-righteous people. Like, I do not like self-righteous people. Like, I think I try to be as merciful as I can to people, but like people that might be going through a hard time, sins, they just constantly repeat the same sins, they have a rough history, past life. I have more sympathy. But people that are self-righteous, people that think they're better than everyone else, I just can't stand them, right? I just can't stand self-righteous people, people that are know-it-alls, right? But the more I'm thinking about it, that statement is as ironic as saying, I am the most humble person in this room, right? When we say, I hate self-righteous people, you know how ironic that sounds? The more you think about it, I hate self-righteous people. It's as ironic as saying, I am the most humble person in this room, or in the entire world. Sometimes we get so worked up with horrible people, we forget Jesus hung out with horrible people. We think those were the outsiders, right? They were the oppressed. But Jesus also hung out with the insiders. He also hung out with people that were in power, right? He hung out with that. He loved remember the young rich man. He loved the young rich man, the man who took advantage of his neighbors. And he loved them. He hung out with leaders, people of power, people that were hypocrites. And here we are at times too quick to get angry, too quick to judge, too quick to associate with those not to associate with those who are self-righteous, hypocrites, and Pharisees. We are quick to cancel people. We're mourning, right? A lot of us here that are Asian American, we might be mourning the last shooting in Atlanta, Georgia of 8 victims, many of whom were Asian. We're mourning for just the violence and the racism that we saw, the shooting in Atlanta. But I was thinking about the sermon, and I was thinking, but do any of us mourn for the blindness of that racist killer? Do any of us mourn that, man, that guy, have sympathy, man, that guy is so blinded by his own hate? We might mourn for black lives, that we know that their lives matter. But I was thinking, do we ever mourn for those cops who are oppressive and racist? Do we ever mourn that they're blind in their own hatred? Do we ever mourn that, man, I have pity on them, that they don't have love, that all they have is racism? You see, this hits home for me, and I'm guilty of this as well. Before we think there is no hope for Pharisees, right? May I remind us that Jesus hung out with Pharisees. One of the Pharisees was named Nicodemus. And that's where Jesus introduces the whole born-again language to Nicodemus, a Pharisee. And he's patient with Nicodemus the whole time. One of the most famous Pharisees was a guy named Saul, who eventually became known as Paul the Apostle. That Jesus stopped him in his track, loved him so much that he blinded his eyes so that he could fix his eyes to change his view. Paul, when he was Saul, was a Pharisee. He was going around trying to cancel Christians, right? And Jesus stops him and changes his views, changes his eyes. And this man now becomes changed in Christ and becomes a staunch supporter of the gospel. If you think God can't love a Pharisee, remember, he also loved you, a hypocrite. There was no hope in ourselves. But brothers and sisters, may I remind you of his grace. And so may I remind us that before we go on and on about, hating the Pharisees, may I remind us that we also are Pharisees as well. And that we are to then walk a bit more with humility. But second, may I say this for us: be careful, listen carefully, be careful in your anger. Right, I just want to put it out there, anger is not a sin per se, right? To be angry is not necessarily a sin per se. That's not part of the Ten Commandments. But before we go off in our anger, even if it's righteous anger, at these times, I want us to be careful in our anger. Why? Because we're not Jesus, right? We're not Jesus. Sometimes it says, the Bible says we can be angry. But be careful in your anger, because we're not Jesus. Ephesians chapter 4, verse 26, it actually says this: if in your anger, right? Paul's saying you can be angry, but he says this: in your anger, do not sin. Right? Man. And so I want to warn us that we see Jesus, he gets angry. but in our anger do not sin. We're more like the Pharisees, therefore, we may falter. And I think what we need to do is, instead of the walk in our journey, let's not walk with this proud gait, like, oh yeah, right? But rather, let's walk with a humble limp. Even in our rebuke, when we're calling someone else out on their sin, we speak truth because we need them to hear the truth. We want them to know Christ. But may we not speak with a Pharisaical attitude of self-righteousness. Remember your own sins when you rebuke others. Sure, we need to speak truth, but we speak truth in love. Not as ones who are holy and righteous, because we know only God is holy, but we want others to know that holiness. We want others to walk in His holiness. And of course, we speak truth. But there is danger to be tempted to think that every time that I can speak in this righteous anger. I do think that we must remember that we are not Jesus. And oftentimes we confuse our self-righteous anger with righteous anger. We think our righteous anger is actually righteous anger, but it's actually self-righteous anger. Does that make sense? Does your anger act like Jesus' anger? Which what? It fleshed out and manifested into love. Or is your anger like the Pharisees who wanted to bring about retribution and revenge? Man, if I was to be real honest, there are many times I've been angry, and rarely did my anger lead to love. Many times my anger led to sin. There are times that someone might accuse me of a false accusation, might insult me. Even when I fight with my family members or when I fight with Gloria, they might insult me, and sometimes they may be right, sometimes they might be wrong, and I might have the moral high ground, but then my anger leads me to sin, and I'll say all sorts of viciousness and retaliations back. So that's why I want us to be careful in our anger, and rather than be angry, I think we ought to have what Paul says actually in Galatians chapter 6 verse 1, that when we call people out, when we speak truth, in Galatians chapter 6 verse 1 it says to restore the person gently, to be merciful, to be patient, and watch ourselves lest we be tempted, Paul says. That's the attitude of saying is like, how dare you, you're so horrible. You're such a bad person. How dare you do that sin? That kind of pompous, arrogant attitude can lead you to fall into sin. Paul says, when you speak truth to someone, speak with humility, knowing that you are also a sinner. Oftentimes, we are too self-righteous in our anger. So even when I see self-righteousness, even when I see racism and corruption, I can dangerously move towards self-righteous anger. But notice Jesus' anger was righteous anger. His anger moved into love. And so that's why I would rather have us, let's not be angry. Because we are so brittle and so fragile. In our anger, we will sin. Jesus is all about not fitting into a group. He is wholly other. Sometimes when we are intolerant to people who are self-righteous, it's because we are also self-righteous, right? I hate saying that to myself, but I hate self-righteous people, but that itself is a self-righteous thought. The cancel culture movement moves in that direction, right? We're going to cancel that person. We're going to cancel this person. They're very good at canceling everyone else. They're filled with self-righteousness. They're filled with self-righteous anger with no grace. But the opponents of cancel culture, they're always like, why do they do that? Why are they, all angry about that? That was in the past. Get over that. They don't take justice seriously enough. They don't take truth seriously enough. And they belittle injustice. But Jesus is radically different from these two camps, right? As I come to a close, we see that especially in the cross. The Father ought to have canceled every single one of us. But he gave us his only begotten Son. The only begotten Son, willing to come down so that you and I would not be canceled. Do you see how Jesus does not fit either in the cancel culture nor in the cancel opponents? His righteous anger leads to love. He takes sin serious enough. He takes injustice serious enough that he has righteous anger towards that sin. And he took it upon himself and died on the cross for us. But like having mercy on this man with a withered hand, he had mercy on us. And he took that wrath upon himself and didn't cancel us, but instead loved us and brought us into his family. So in this cancel culture world and climate we live in, may we be willing to live in justice and speak in truth. Speak out against injustice and racism and evil, but always with a sense of humility, with grace, and with mercy. When anyone wrongs you, let's be wary of our anger, lest we fall into the same pit. Let's be wary of attacking, even if it's to be done righteously. Let's be wary of our anger. But rather, I would encourage us to have an attitude of love, compassion, and grace, for we have a God who is gracious and merciful to us. Let me pray for us. Lord, we look at our world today and see too often pretenders of righteousness. This cancel culture world is saturated with false sense of righteousness. Often it leads to shaming, canceling, and rejecting. Help your people here, C4, to take justice and truth seriously, because we see you as a holy God. But also help your people to have this balance of grace